Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation of Kelli Connell's Pictures for Charis. This online event comes to you from the Photographic Arts Council Los Angeles, a nonprofit organization that creates unique collaborative programming that engages and educates the community in an evolving public conversation about photography and photo-based art. PAC-LA's online offerings are made possible in part through the generous support of the Herb Ritts Foundation. My name is Hannah Sloan, and I'm an independent curator based in LA. And this talk is one of several online events that I'll be hosting on behalf of the Photographic Arts Council this year. All of these events are free and open to the public, and all will focus on women in photography. Thank you, Michael Dawson, for inviting me to be your host. And thank you, Michael Hawley and Sean Kennedy, for your support and technical assistance. If you would like more information about supporting PAC-LA or would like to become a member, please visit their website at paclosangeles.com. Following Kelli's presentation, we'll have a Q&A. Please make sure to place your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so we can address your questions at the end of this discussion. Our guest today, Kelli Connell, is a visual artist whose work investigates sexuality, gender, identity, and the photographer-sitter relationship. She is currently on faculty at Columbia College in Chicago, where she teaches photography to undergraduate and graduate students. Kelli holds a BFA in Photography and Visual Art Studies from the University of North Texas and an MFA in Studio Art from Texas Women's University. Her work is held in museum collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the J. Paul Getty Museum, to name a few. She's received numerous fellowships, including one from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Her first monograph, titled Kelli Connell, Double Life, was published by Decode Books in 2011. Her recent monograph, Pictures for Charis, was co-published by Aperture and Center for Creative Photography, Tucson, in 2024, and will be the main subject of our talk today. Her exhibition, Pictures for Charis, is currently on view at the Cleveland Museum of Art through May 25th and will travel to the Center for Creative Photography in Arizona this summer. The exhibition dates are August 22nd through December 6th, 2025. I first discovered Kelli's work while living on Wildcat Hill in the Carmel Highlands for 2 months in 2023. This is where Edward Weston, the famed 20th century photographer, and his partner, model, and collaborator, Charis Wilson, lived and worked together for over a decade. I immediately became enamored with the project and am delighted to introduce it to those of you who are not yet familiar. This book, which I have right here, is much more than an artist monograph. Pictures for Charis is a chronicle of Kelli's research into the lives of Charis and Edward, their relationship, their work, and the dynamics between them as an older male photographer and a much younger muse who also happened to be an incredible writer. It is also a chronicle of Kelli's own relationship, and I personally found her narrative and writing to be as riveting as the images that she takes. In my humble opinion, this book belongs on a shelf alongside Edward Weston's daybooks, California and the West, and Charis Wilson's Through Another Lens: My Years with Edward Weston. You can purchase this book at Aperture, and I will pop a link in our chat box during the talk so you can order your copy. It is my pleasure now to welcome Kelli Connell, who will share her screen and take us through a presentation of Pictures for Charis. Welcome, Kelli.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really a generous introduction. And thanks everyone at PAC-LA for joining us today. I'll just go ahead and jump in. Okay, so I thought it might be a good place to start to share my first body of work entitled Double Life. I'm actually still working on this project. It began in 2002. But some of the threads that I weave in Pictures for Charis are a little bit similar. Some of the concerns are still there. So what you see here appears to be two women in a relationship, but it's really the same one model photographed twice, and then put together in each scene. And what I really like about this way of working is that the work can be read in two different ways. On one hand, it reads as a couple in a relationship evolving over time. And on the other hand, it's about the self and the many different sides of the self that we may have depending on who we're with. Many people think when they see this work in a gallery, they wonder, are these sisters? Are they lovers? Are they twins? And then once they get to like this, the fourth or fifth image, they realize, whoa, wait, this might be the same one person twice. And what I like about that discovery is that people have a preconceived idea about who someone is, and then that changes. Just like in our real life, when we might have an idea about someone, and then once we get to know them, we change our mind. I hope no one out there is feeling like this today. This picture is entitled 4 a.m. And to make this work, I always use a stand-in if possible. And most of the time, the stand-in is me. So for this image, you'll see here that I was actually wearing one outfit. My model, Kiba Jacobson is her name, was wearing another. And we acted out the scene, took several pictures, and then once we switched out the film, because this was back in 2002, we changed clothes, came back to the scene, and reenacted it again as the separate second characters. Once I get my film developed, I make contact sheets and then make these small hand-cut collages, which are my favorite part of the process. And from there, I can tell which two photographs I'm interested in using. And then I scan the negatives and in Photoshop create a seamless composite. So her hand is really on my back, and I think that intimacy that's created by Kiba actually interacting with someone is what makes the work have its more emotional or subtle, intimate tone. So you can't ignore that this work appears to document the lives of two women, and I am very interested in what happens when two women are in a relationship and take on both of those roles. Sometimes one person might seem more dominant, the other one more submissive. Sometimes I flip that to where sometimes they're more masculine or feminine or shy or a little bit aggressive, and then sometimes they're on the same page. The clothing is a range of clothing from like masculine to feminine to androgynous, and sometimes they're both wearing feminine clothing and sometimes they're both wearing masculine clothing. For me, it's really important that the one single self is allowed to be seen as a very fluid being and to be very broad in the definition of who we can be in our culture in the time that we're living in now. For me, I'm less interested in the technical aspects of the work, so I'm not so interested that this work was created by using Photoshop. I'm much more interested in the emotional tone and the energy that you feel when you're looking at the image. This picture is entitled Kitchen Tension, and it appears as if these two individuals have just gotten into a fight or they're about to get into a fight, but there's definitely an unspoken uneasiness in the room. This piece is entitled The Space Between. Most of my work comes from, I get ideas from my own personal life, but I leave this open to where I also receive inspiration by watching movies, reading books, and watching people in public. This image in particular was based on Krzysztof Kieslowski's French movie entitled Blue. And in that movie, the male character at the end of the movie comes in to the scene to tell the female character whose hair is completely dry, he's like soaking wet, He came in to tell her his true feelings for her. And what I like about movies and fiction is that often as readers or viewers, we can identify with both characters. So I placed her loosely based on that idea from the film. Most of the work is highly choreographed and planned in advance. We decide the time of day, the location, the exact clothing, the props, the actions that are going to be acted out, and the emotional tone. We always carry extra clothes just in case there's something that catches our eye on the fly. And this image is a really good example of that. This is also on the cover of the monograph. This is entitled Carnival. It was made in 2006. And we were driving from one location to another and happened to pass a very small carnival that was happening in a mall parking lot. It looks grand here, but it was really tiny. But we took that exit immediately, pulled over, bought our tickets, ran in, and Kiva's really comfortable changing clothes and just acting on the fly no matter what's going on. So I was really lucky to be able to get this image here. Believe it or not, this is one of the more complicated images in Photoshop because the lighting had changed quite drastically as the sun was setting. So to get the color right, it took me a little extra time. I often think that my images lie as documents, but tell truths as printed photographs or as evidence for something that was really going on or a feeling that I really had on the interior self shown in a document. This picture is entitled The Valley, and this is the contact sheet here for that. This is actually Betsy as the stand-in, and Betsy is in the work Pictures for Charis that you will see coming up. And then here's the collage for that. And so now moving on to Pictures for Charis. Like Hannah mentioned, Aperture and the Center for Creative Photography published the monograph a year ago, last March. And I thought it might be a really good introduction to just start with Charis herself. This image was made in 1941 in Princeton by Edward Weston, and Charis Wilson was a writer, and she came from a family of writers. Her dad, Henry Leon Wilson, also known as H.L. Wilson, was a well-known writer in his time. He was a playwright and also wrote in a local column that people used to read all the time. Her grandmother and her great aunt were also well-known writers in the Bohemian Carmel scene. So Charis grew up around writers and she wanted to be a writer herself. She got a scholarship to go to Sarah Lawrence University, but it was during the time of the Depression, and HL was also having financial problems. So her parents told her that she couldn't go to college. She actually moved to San Francisco on her own when she was very young and lived there for about a year and a half and had kind of a wild time, and then moved back to Carmel and worked at her mother's dress shop. And within a few months, she had met Edward Weston at a concert. And Edward at the time was seeing Sonia Noskowiak, who was a member of the F20, what's it called? F24 group. I'm just losing the words for that now. F8 group. What is it?
64. 64.
64. Oh my gosh. That like just flew out of my brain. F64 group. And Sonia is the one that told Edward that she thought that Charis would be a good model for his photographs. And so Charis agreed and they set up a time to meet. And then he ended up in a relationship with her that lasted for 11 years. So my book traces their relationship. Just like in Double Life, I'm very interested in relationships. And it starts with the first photograph he made of Charis to the very last photograph that he made of hers. And it interweaves the story of my relationship with Betsy into kind of a travel log where we start in Chicago, go to California, and then wind our way back to Chicago. The text that Charis has written is included. So my book has text pages that are on this beautiful light pink paper. And then my photographs are on white pages. Some of Charis's text is also included within my text block, and Edward Weston images are included within the pink pages as well. They're kept separate from mine. The inspiration for this deep dive into Charis Wilson started when I read this book entitled California in the West, which was published in 1940 by Charis Wilson and Edward Weston. Edward was the first photographer to receive the Guggenheim Fellowship, and with that fellowship, he on 17 different trips around California and the surrounding western states, and he made more than 1,400 8x10 negatives, and she kept an extensive travel log. And from that travel log, in this book, there's chapters of text that were written by Charis and then 96 photographs by Weston. And you can see here that the more off-white pages are Charis's text pages, and the white pages are Edward's photographs. I was less interested in Edward's photography, honestly, because the printing in this book is kind of subpar. It's pretty flat in tonal range. If I know some of you have probably seen Edward Weston's images in galleries or museums, and they're absolutely exquisite. But I really fell in love with Charis's writing and wanted to get to know more about her as a person. This is her autobiography, Through Another Lens, My Years with Edward Weston. And after I read California in the West, I then read her autobiography. And from those two books, I was able to put together a list of locations to be able to visit and make new landscape works and then portraits of Betsy at those sites. And after reading those two, I learned that the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson housed Charis Wilson's archives and also Edward Weston's archives. So I made 5 to 6 separate research trips there. And the first research trips, I was focused on looking at Charis's archives only. And then eventually I had to look through Edward's as well. This is just a photograph of her drafts for her autobiography. And then this is just a picture of my very first draft of the manuscript for Pictures for Charis. And then I thought I'd put a few details in here of the show that's up in Cleveland right now, just so you can see how it's installed. So in the center of the gallery, there are 48 original Edward Weston images that trace the relationship of Charis and Edward. It starts with the first picture he took of her, and then I was the one who made the edit for their relationship that starts with the first image to the last image he made of her. So that's what you're looking at in these vitrine-like structures. On the wall, you have my images that are very large scale. The landscape photographs are 40 by 50. The portraits of Betsy are 32 by 40 or 20 by 25. And there's an interesting echo that happens when you're looking at his work and mine on the wall, referencing this jump in time of 80 year in an 80-year span. And this is just a detail of two of my images. And then another detail of his up close with mine on the wall. So, Charis, this is one of the first pictures that Edward made of Charis, and within a few weeks of meeting each other, Charis agreed to meet to model for him. It was actually Sonia Noskowiak, who Edward was living with at the time, who told Edward about Charis and set up the first modeling session. But this is typical of Edward's work of models in the 1920s, where you don't see their faces, they're often cropped, and it's all about their form. Many of the women he photographed were dancers. Some of them did have jobs in Carmel, and their anonymity. So for Edward, he was interested in form, and that anyone, if you don't see their face, they become less specific to a person. But for many of these women, showing their face might be problematic based on their job. But he broke his rules with how he was photographing right away with Charis, and shows her as a full person with her own gestures and her own body language. This is from that same photo shoot where they were taking a break. She's drinking some wine, and he jumped up, seeing her like this, and said, "Hold on," ran and got his camera and made this picture. So it's not posed, it's exactly as she was sitting, which I think is really interesting. Charis's mother, Helen, also was a model for several photographers and an inspiration for several poets' writings in Carmel. This is Helen posing for Arnold Gant in 1905 in a field of California poppies, I believe. And then in 1935, Charis and Edward moved to Santa Monica, California, and this picture here, which is a well-known Weston image, is one of the very first images he made with an 8x10 camera of a person. So he was testing out the camera on their rooftop deck, and he had to scoot really far back. She scooted as far back as she could into their bedroom behind them. Their door is open here. But he knew that the exposure, if he exposed her, you wouldn't see the bed or the bedroom clutter behind them. And then this is just the image in the book. And then my loose riff on that photograph using Betsy as a model. This image was taken in 29 Palms. And then this is the sand dunes in Oceano, San Luis Obispo. And then these images you might have seen of Charis rolling down the sand dunes there. And I think I'll stop here and read one section in the book. This is from page 18, so it's early on. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and scroll through these till you hit my images, so you see my images with these. But this portrait was made of Charis during the Guggenheim travels for California and the West at Lake Ediza. They were actually traveling with Ansel Adams and a small group of rock climbers. This is Lake Tenaya. Those famous juniper trees that Edward photographed, that's very close to this photograph here. If you walk up on that ridge, you'll see these trees. They're still there, I think. And then Charis and Edward, after the California and the West travels, decided to settle in Carmel. right beside this is Wildcat Hill, where Hannah and I both stayed, and you can stay too. But right next to this on the right is Charis's childhood home called Ocean Home. And her dad was in some pretty significant financial troubles and had to sell the home. And before the sale went through, Charis convinced him to sell Edward and her a very small parcel of land across a ravine. So once that sale went through, then they were able to build their own house on the property. This image shows Charis reading a book on top of her writing studio. And this image here is made of Charis in the backyard of her childhood home in their swimming pool. It's another image that Edward did not choreograph or direct. Charis was really just laying like that, soaking up the sun. Her father had just passed away a few months before, and it was one of the last times she would be able to enjoy the home. And I'm really struck by this photograph. I do have one small piece of text from the book to read from this. And I'll just start here. So it was Chaz, a college crush, who first introduced me to Charis. Chaz and I were photography majors together at the University of North Texas. The summer before I graduated, we spent a lot of time together. Before my lifeguard shifts, we would lay on the floor of Chaz's apartment, poring over piles of photography books. The charged space between our bodies was compounded by the excitement we felt from devouring those images. We were enamored with Larry Sultan's pictures from home and shocked yet fascinated by Larry Clark's Tulsa. We returned often to William Eggleston's guide, delighted by his sense of humor and delectable use of color. We studied picture after picture in monographs by photographers like Deanne Arbus, Sally Mann, and Francesca Woodman. That summer, Chaz gave me a postcard with a picture of a woman floating in a pool. She looked as if she had been there a long time, swaying gently on the water's surface. Her legs rested on the pool's shallow ledge. I didn't know that this was a photograph of Charis then. The title simply read Nude, Floating. I also didn't know that the image was made by Edward Weston. But this image stayed with me from that first experience and was one of the main reasons why I went on this crazy deep dive about Charis. In 1941, Edward and Charis went on another cross-country road trip throughout the 48 states for a project where he was photographing for a book called Leaves of Grass. And that included Edward's photographs and then Walt Whitman's text this time. On that trip, Charis actually found herself attracted to another man. And it was on this trip that a fissure in their relationship started to develop, not only because Charis had feelings for someone else, but because Edward was, I believe, showing the first signs of Parkinson's disease and was depressed. And then there were other things going on in their relationship as well. But this one image that was made of Charis in New York was made on the day that Charis was to meet her love interest for dinner that night. And Charis actually, out of all the images Weston made of her, has the hardest time with this image. And I can kind of see why, because this lamp feels very interrogative. She's very exposed and vulnerable and just going on, me knowing what was going on in their relationship. I can just feel for her in this one, even though it's such a stunning photograph. Back in Carmel, they had to cut that trip short because the war broke out. And so Edward was no longer able to make photographs in the Point Lobos area, which was closed down for war efforts. And he made many tableaus with Charis as a subject on the property. And this is the last photograph that he made of her, which is in Big Sur, just very close to their home. It's at one of their friends' houses, and it's called Winter Idol. But you'll notice over time, the camera to subject distance starts to get even further and further away from them as their relationship starts to kind of fall apart. And this is a detail of that photograph in the book. So this is my, I'll just show you my photographs now. Betsy and I took our first trip out west in 2014 to photograph. And when I came back and saw the images, I realized there was no way I could tell the story that I wanted to tell without a text. So I began to write. And this section is from page 18 of the book. I look through my sketchbook and read my notes as Betsy takes a turn behind the wheel. In the months preceding this trip, I had scoured articles by critics and curators and photographers for details about Charis. I traveled to the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson to sift through Charis and Edward's separate archives. I read their personal letters to one another, to family and friends. I carefully touched the memorabilia that had once belonged to them. I held each of the figurines Edward had given Charis in the palm of my hand. I picked up a shawl Edward had given Charis from one of his trips to Mexico and tenderly ran my fingers across the intricately woven pattern and fringe at its edges. Charis would have not written a memoir at all if it were not for her gnawing frustration with how narrowly Edward and his work were interpreted in the decades after his death in 1958. She had carefully cut out the articles that had so aggravated her, annotating the margins with passionate exclamation points, question marks, and X's, underlining text often in red, sometimes twice. Later in her life, Charis was increasingly invited to give lectures on Edward and her time with him. In her notes for one of these engagements, she outlines her initial response to the invitation to speak. And this is Charis's voice now. No, of course not. 1, I'm not a speaker. 2, I'm not a photographer. 3, I'm not an expert. 4, I don't have theories about photography. 5, I don't even have slides. Then I thought of some yes buts. 1, haven't you been complaining in recent years that Edward's image was getting more and more unrecognizable? 2, shouldn't you try to correct some of this growing mythology before it gets any further out of hand? 3, why leave it to people who never knew him to furnish fanciful accounts of what they assume he was like? 4, why indeed? Sifting through her papers, I found notes for another such talk. And this is Charis's voice also. Most of what is written and said about him leaves me somewhere between mildly amused and violently outraged. I know that I overreact and that the work of history is simplification. We collapse centuries into the dark ages. We gloss over years and decades as the Roaring Twenties or the Depression. And as history gets simplified, so must individual lives. All the sharp, significant incidents that we've lived through and been shaped by eventually settle into a soft, generalized image, as if what was once a dazzlingly sharp photograph, full of fine detail, faded to a thoroughly pictorial mist with barely a discernible subject. This simplification process is at work today, transforming the real EW into an imaginary historical character, and there is no stopping it. I'm aware it isn't possible to set the record straight. I hope, however, to produce a memoir in the coming year that will stem a little of the tide of nonsense that's been pouring E's way ever since big money and the photo market made him an easy target for the game of revelations. This is my writing now. How hard it must be to see someone so important to you, with whom you spent a significant part of your life, reduced in a few paragraphs to a person you don't recognize. When we lose people close to us, we become aware of the utter failure of language to describe the reality of who they were, and we realize the ways in which the stories people tell have the ability to reshape our understandings. And if the person is as well known as Edward Weston, their lives and art can readily be interpreted, used by other people to advance their own narratives, their own agendas. Unlike a photograph, a life is not immutable once the person who lived it has died. The life is remade by those who remain, Charis writes. In article after article, I watched the man I loved being transformed into someone I could have never loved. This flesh and blood man was becoming a cliche-ridden myth created by people who never knew him. But photographs too create myths, shape perception. They allude to company kept. They portray a choice of dress, a mannerism made in one brief instance. They offer clues, but they, like words, fail to deliver the embodied essence of someone, what it was like to be in their presence, to meet their eye, smell their scent, feel the warmth of their body in an embrace. They are distilled to an image and transferred to a piece of paper, a static likeness, a still photograph, a shadow. So a lot of my writing does talk about that simplification process that we'll all go through after we pass away, where we will just become the stories people tell about us. And no one will know what it's like to really be in our presence. And this work also tries to recover a history that wasn't told about Charis and Edward's life, which I think is really important to tell. My photographs out west, the landscape photographs, many of them I'm trying to stand in the exact spot that Edward stood. But also many of them, I break those rules and I'll turn the camera to the left or the right or even behind me. Most of the time I'm making images based on Charis's writing and keeping her right beside me. This is Edward's photograph of Dante's view in Death Valley, and then my photograph here. And this is my image taken in Golden Canyon, which is very different than Edward's image, which is much more diagonal and less soft and I don't know if feminine is the right word, but this one is definitely a much more soft approach. This image is entitled Preston. So many of the pictures of Betsy, I'm titling Betsy, comma, Lake Ediza, and then the date. But then other times I will riff off giving her different names. So there was an earlier image named April. This one's called Preston. And that shift in naming allows Betsy to be seen as a much more fluid or androgynous, more masculine presenting or feminine presenting person. This is loosely based on an Edward Weston photograph he made of his friend Preston Holder. This is a detail from the book. This is the only picture in the whole book where I'm included. This is called Partners. And if you were to travel to the Oceano Dunes today, you would have to rent a razor scooter, one of those really crazy dune buggies. I had to wear one of those ant-like helmets and had my 4x5 camera and tripod with me. And Betsy was super excited to be able to drive on this, and I was 100% terrified. But I was really struck how gorgeous and quiet Edward's pictures look compared to these marred dunes now. This image was the first picture that I took in this project where I knew what I was going to do that led me down this rabbit hole for Charis. So I had been photographing Betsy since 2004 when we first met, but I didn't quite know what that work was doing. I knew I had some strong portraits on their own, but I didn't know what, I mean, I was kind of floundering, trying to figure out what the project was going to be. We were staying in Lakeside, Michigan once, and she was laying on this sand-colored comforter, and I looked over at her and immediately thought of the sand dune images that Weston had taken of Charis. So that's what led me to reading everything I could about Charis and starting this journey. This is an image made by Weston of Charis at Lake Ediza, and I love the comparison of this photograph made by Ansel Adams on the same trip. And I have a short, very short section to read there that talks about this image. So this is from page 82 in the book. One of my favorite pictures of Charis was taken at Devil's Post Pile, made while on the same trip to Lake Ediza by Ansel Adams. Her short hair is slicked back. She looks handsome in men's clothes she is wearing. She leans on her side and cups her hands to block the wind to light her cigarette. Here she is a heartthrob. This image is an interesting comparison to the more overtly sensual depictions we are offered by Edward's lens. Charis included this image in her memoir. Every time I flip to see it, I swoon. Charis's ease, not only in front of Ansel's lens, but in herself as a woman, is evident. She was free to cut her hair short, wear men's clothing, smoke, and earn a living, or try to, despite the conventional expectation for women in those days. And Betsy and I did this crazy thing where we tried to hike to Lake Ediza to try to find this exact rock that Charis is leaning against. And it was kind of nuts because it's a 7-mile hike in and a 7-mile hike out, but I was too nervous to stay overnight because of bears. So I'm not super athletic and wasn't in Chicago. There's just not places to go hike that much. You've got the lake and that's it. So anyway, we hiked in and had like 2.5 hours to try to find this rock. And I don't think we ever found it, but I was working and turned around and saw Betsy like this. And I was like, oh, that's the picture I need to take for Lake Ediza. So Becky Simpson and I were actually talking, and this summer or next, we might go again to try to find that rock. Becky's a curator at the CCP. These are images, these are the juniper trees that are at Lake Tenaya. And Betsy and I were looking for these and jokingly calling them vagina trees because they definitely look like that. And when we were searching for them, we actually found like the mother nature of all like vaginas out there. This picture doesn't even do it justice, and mine doesn't either, being 40 by 50. This was like 30 feet tall, and I felt so conflicted making this image because it felt pornographic, and Betsy was like, it's just granite and rocks, but it was really hilarious. So that part's talked about loosely in the book as well. But we did find the trees, and this moment when I was making this photograph, I really did feel like I was standing in the exact spot that Edward had been, and that I could almost feel Charis, laying on a rock nearby, soaking up the sun. Here's my image of Lake Tenaya. And this image is called Santa Fe of Betsy, and I have a short passage to read from that as well. Only when subjects are photographed over long periods of time Can we get closer to their essence? And even then, we are still on the perimeter, left to make sense of our interpretations of them. Who the subject is changes over time as the relationship between the photographer and sitter changes. In the beginning, a love interest is a fiction, a fantasy. We imagine who the person may become in relation to us. We daydream. Only after the relationship is established over years and shared experiences does it settle into a rhythm, a pattern that is easily recognized. Honor de Balzac famously said, "Marriage must incessantly contend with a monster that devours everything, familiarity." Desires, fantasies, and fictions fade with time. The heat of a glance, the electricity of a touch become distant memories. Over the years, this familiarity can grow to be comfortable, easy, and warm. The camera allows us to see a scene for what it has become. The process, the slow accumulation of a person taking a photograph of another person. They carry the shared history of their relationship with them. It is in their bodies, their gestures, the space between them. It is in the room. This is Chama River, which is in Abiquiu, New Mexico. There's a small nod to Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz in the book, and Georgia O'Keeffe painted this river many times. This is China Cove in Point Lobos. Charis, when she was younger, swam in these caves, and Edward photographed in Point Lobos for decades. This is also in Point Lobos of the surf, and turning my camera directly behind me are these images of flowers. Charis often would describe the ground and flowers and fauna and wildlife in such detail. I felt like this picture was more for her. This is an image of Betsy made in Charis's writing studio at Wildcat Hill. And this is an image made by Weston in 1943 called Springtime. And you can really feel, I think, the emotional distance between them. She's inside the house. There's a screen between them. You can't quite see her face. There's two old shoes on a pipe, and then three daisy tops that are laid on that wood bin roof. And I think it's a metaphor for what was going on in their relationship, and only lasted like 2 more years. This is an image I made on the property. And then this is the last photograph that I made of Betsy in 2022. And I didn't realize it at the time, but the place where I made this at Doug Short's home in Big Sur was also the same place that was the last place where Edward photographed Charis. I did find where this pool was in Charis's backyard. It's filled in now to where the lighter shade of grass is where the pool used to be. And then this is the swing image that I showed you before that's based on the last picture he made of Charis. I was able to find that tree at Doug Short's home. And this image was made in 2018. When I returned back in 2022, the gardener had accidentally cut down that tree. So a lot of the book also talks about the passing of time and that there's nothing we can do about time passing. The photographs will outlive us, but nature will keep changing and we'll keep changing as well. And then these are the last 2 images in the presentation. And I'll just read a short passage. Ultimately, making pictures for Charis was not something that I could do for her. Instead, what I learned was a new way of seeing, through a context that she carefully outlined, a frame of reference that allowed her to have power, freedom, and confidence in her body and sexuality, and as an artist. Charis wrote through another lens, not only out of love and concern for Edward and his legacy, but also to disavow the narrow perspectives that had reduced her story to being one of his nudes, a participant in one of his philanderous affairs, or simply his muse. These are delimiting terms of possession that fail to capture what an active partner Charis was to Edward. It is through Charis that I choose to see Edward and the pictures they made together. Someone once told me that no one is gone until their last story is told, and I'm glad that Charis shared her story. Charis's writing enticed me to experience the places she had gone, to see them through her eyes and my own. I leaned against the same cool rocks and rested in the shade of the same trees that she had. My hands, like hers, touched the same calm surface of Lake Tenaya. Charis was with me, waiting to be found, her body still resting on boulders and tree trunks and her shape still visible on the sand. This work, along with the images made by Weston, will be shown over the course of the next 2 years in the traveling exhibitions. It's my hope that this distance in time, the 80 years between these projects and the distance between the work and the exhibition, can create echoes as an avenue to understand the work anew and to allow for broader definitions in gender that not only champion Betsy's androgyny, but Charis's bohemian spirit, one that felt comfortable not conforming to the traditional definitions of femininity. By weaving together our stories, it is my hope that Charis and Edward can be remembered as a far more complicated and interesting couple and individuals than how she was portrayed over the years, and he. It is my goal to honor Charis, to pay attention to a woman who was strong, who had agency, who was a dedicated collaborator and a human who experienced a relationship that was filled with desire, companionship, love, and pain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. I think anyone who isn't familiar with the book can hear that last passage you wrote and understand how beautiful the writing is in connection with the imagery. So I hope everyone will get a chance to read it. Thank you so much. I'm going to encourage people to put questions into the Q&A chat. We have one right now that I have a follow-up question to it. And that is from Evans, and it says, can you speak to the approval process in relation to Betsy? I'm guessing that means sort of the approval of using the images or making the images. If that's not correct, please clarify.
Yeah, of course. So, as I mentioned, I had been photographing Betsy since we first met from in 2004 on. And Betsy, unlike my collaborator Kiba, is a little bit more of a reluctant model. Kiba Jacobson for the Double Life work is super energetic, loves being in front of the camera, and is kind of like Sally Mann's oldest daughter, where she just feels this thrill and feels like she's making work by using her body. Betsy, on the other hand, is much more shy and introverted like me. We're kind of similar in that way. But she felt like it was really important for her to go ahead and be a subject in my photographs because she wanted people who look like her to be represented in art because she is androgynous. She comes from, she's a sculptor. She got her degree at Yale in sculpture, and she teaches at Loyola University here in Chicago. She has a background in feminist and queer studies. So for her, it was more about having a body like hers represented in art. And she felt like that was super important. So she wanted to make photographs with me for that reason.
In the book, Betsy actually writes the afterword, and she addresses the issue of being photographed and representing a queer aspect of this project, which is really beautifully written as well.
Yeah.
And I have a follow-up question to that. Kelli, I hope other people ask questions because we have you here. Um, and I know there's a lot to ask, but there's a part in the book where you reference the portrait of Charis at the lake, Lake Ediza, I think it's called, and you call it the most compelling portrait you've ever seen, or one of them. And I've always felt that same response to it. And you also talk about how it might be the first portrait that Edward took of Charis where she feels like she's performing herself. And you also mentioned that when she's on the dunes, that it feels like she is more independent in those photos than the earlier nudes where it's more close up and cropped. And so I'm wondering, was there ever a moment in your relationship with Betsy as a subject that you suddenly realized she was performing herself and you were capturing it versus you kind of directing her, and what when that was in the relationship, the personal relationship and the photographer to subject relationship?
Yeah, so well, two things I wanted to mention based on your question. The first is I'm glad you pointed out the Lake Ediza image and the dunes images. I think one thing that fascinated me about all of this research and this project was me grappling with how I had learned about Edward Weston through photo history. So the dune image I had seen of Karis and a cropped image, but you see those very separated from context. And usually the art historian or the critic tells their own story. They love telling that Weston had all these lovers, like they just go on about his machismo, that's what they make him sound like. So, learning about him through her and then reading in the archives these letters that dancers had written to him and other women had written to him, it made me think about who tells history and who gets to tell history and what story they're telling. And most of the people who told Edward's story were white men that were telling stories in a way that was more about their own experience as a man, rather than if these women had told a story about Edward like Charis did. I think we would understand him in a very different way. The truth is, he was really non-conventional himself. He was a bohemian. He liked to hang out with anyone who was kind of off the grid or different. Edward
Mhm.
often would cross-dress at parties and wear dresses. And one of his best friends, Ramiel McGeehee, was a queer man. Marguerite Mather was a lesbian that he made photographs with. He hung out with a crowd that we never had. There hasn't been extensive writing about Weston having a more fluid sense of self, but I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't. So that's one part there. Um, but the Lake Ediza picture is the first picture where her name is mentioned rather than just nude, comma, the date. It
So
actually says Charis, comma, Lake Ediza, 1936, which I think is really important. And it's also interesting that she was actually sitting right across from Ansel Adams talking, and Edward made Ansel move so that he could put the camera down and take that picture of Charis. So I keep thinking of Charis talking to Ansel intimately and then Edward coming. But with Betsy, many times she's acting as Charis in the images, or she's acting as Edward, or I'm acting as Charis, or I'm acting as Edward. I'm very used to choreographing and directing scenes like I do in Double Life, but
Mhm.
there are a few pictures where Betsy was just sitting as she was sitting or doing something she was just doing that I saw and took that also happened to me that wasn't directed. It was truly how Betsy stands or walks or, holds herself. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a great question from Alia Mali in New Mexico. Can you describe your relationship to the idea of re-photography, and or do you consider this project to be in that line of inquiry or something else?
Yeah, so it's very loosely aligned with rephotography. I think it's more aligned with the idea of going on a pilgrimage to experience someone's presence in a place or to kind of have them with you. There are several photographers that go on rephotography quests, like Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe, who I talk about in the book. I'm less interested in the very technical aspects of standing in the same place, using the same film, using the same camera, using the same developer so that it looks exactly the same. I'm much more driven in a conceptual approach that keeps Charis with me, and it was really fun. I realized through this project how fun rephotography is. You do get a rush when you're standing in the same place and you see the picture from 1930 and you see the scene look almost exactly the same. It's a super big rush, but for me, the emotional tone of the work, and how all of the work will inform, all the pictures kind of inform an overall narrative emotionally, that's way more important for me than trying to make perfect photographs based on how Weston made pictures.
Fantastic answer. We have a couple of questions about your writing, so I'm going to fold them in together. Um, Craig says, Kelli, you and Charis are both beautiful writers. Are there other writers to whom you feel a kinship? And Lynn says, Kelli, I can't remember if you mentioned this, but did you think of yourself as a writer as well in the early days,
Oh gosh.
college or earlier? Your writing was so very moving. So
Oh.
compliments in your writing. And did you consider yourself a writer very early on? And are there other writers to whom you feel a kinship either through this project or in general?
Yeah, well, thank you both for just the kind words about my writing. That actually, I'm not a trained writer, so I had written a few short pieces for Art Lies magazine, which were just art reviews. So I enjoyed writing, but I'd never written anything at this length, and I didn't go to school in a creative writing program. So when I knew that there needed to be a text for this, I actually took writing classes regularly, and then I met with a writing teacher frequently, and then I reached out to people in the writing world that would read edits of mine, and I was kind of just learning on the go. But my entire art practice changed based on me learning to write. So in the mornings, I would wake up with coffee and write right away, even if it was just 30 minutes every morning. Um, and sometimes on the road, I would be taking notes on a piece of paper on the steering wheel. It was a mess. Like my notes at the archive or my notes all over. Like now I've learned how to organize those better, and I'm in a really good practice of reading more and writing in the morning. And writing is a big part of my practice now, and it's been really fun to do something new. So that's been great. Uh, Writers that I feel a kinship with, it kind of depends on which project I'm working on. So for this project, one book that I really enjoyed was it's My Autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jen Shapland. So she tells Carson McCullers' story, but I love that she says it's my autobiography of instead of claiming a biography, and it interweaves her story also as a queer writer researching Carson McCullers in a new way. So that one really stood out.
That sounds great. I'm going to read our last question, and it comes from someone named Fritz, and it says they say, I like the photos and tribute to, oh, sorry, I apologize. Let me find the question. I wonder, Kelli, if you could talk more about using a medium which is easiest to use in simplistic nonfiction ways to tell different truths possible with fiction. I think the question is about that one of the things you said at the beginning of the talk, which is sometimes it's easier to tell the truth with fiction. If you could touch on that for a moment before we
Yeah.
wrap.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing with photography that we often believe that there's a truth involved to that, because most photography, I would say, it is a fiction, or it's telling just part of a story. We see someone's likeness here, and that is a truth. But as far as how, in this image that we're looking at on the screen, how that might represent Betsy, it's really how I see Betsy that's represented, or the emotional, emotions between the two of us that are captured. So if another photographer were photographing Betsy, it would look very different than how I photograph her. So I often feel like the photographer's personality is coming through in the images, and it creates this brand new thing. But so documentary photography or street photography has always been a puzzle for me in that way. But when I'm able to direct a scene and think about what emotional tone I want, in that way, I feel like there's a truth, because it feels like an inner truth or an inner emotion that I'm able to make into a work on a piece of paper.
Amazing. Thank you. For anyone who still needs it, I put a link to aperture.org where you can get the book Pictures of Charis. And I've also put links to PAC LA and Kelli's website and my website. And thank you so much, Kelli. You are my inaugural guest during the 2025 online events that I'll be hosting for Photographic Arts Council LA. And I hope everyone who's still tuned in will go to their website and look for more information on our upcoming events. Again, they're all going to focus on women photographers. And we're also going to do some Instagram live events, which will give our audience access to visiting photographers in their homes and studios. So I hope you will come back for those events. And thank you so much, Kelli. I hope to meet you in person if you can visit Los Angeles or Southern California in the future. And I'd love to be in touch with you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Hannah. This was really fun. Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Yes.
night.
Thanks for all the compliments. Ciao, everyone.